When it comes to a boat and boating, it's a pretty common saying that the only thing better than having a boat is having a friend with a boat. And for that friend and their boat, this can bring about more than just your typical boat problems. Whenever you have multiple people operating and using a boat, it can bring up a few different things that you wouldn't think that you would have to deal with. And that is on top of the things that you already typically would have to deal with when it comes to normal boat problems. This week we were dealing with a couple of these different issues, which allows us the ability to show you the importance of some of the systems on your boat and how you can make sure that you avoid having to deal with some of these issues. Now, it's pretty standard when it comes to a boat that most of us know how important the automatic float switch and bilge pump are. Here on the old Venture, when doing the normal routine of occasionally checking the bilge pump and float switch to make sure that they were operating properly, I found that one of the float switches has already failed and is no longer turning on the bilge pump to pump out any water that builds up back here in the bilge. Not a big deal, we've got two of them back here. We just need to pull out this back float switch and replace it with a new one. But when it comes to making sure that the water doesn't build up in the bilge, it doesn't always mean that we are trying to avoid having the boat sink. Sometimes a faulty bilge pump can lead to other issues that you might not think about. Ironically, it turns out that we had this exact issue happen on another boat that came in the marina this week, where we've got a nice Boston whaler here, and in the cabin we've got a forward bilge pump that has the float switch built into the bilge pump. And this pump down here has failed. The float is no longer turning on the pump, which has allowed water to build up here in the center console, which you wouldn't think too much about since it's in the cabin and the water should be able to make its way down into the bilge and to the back where the back pumps can pump out the water. But in this case here, that didn't happen. And though we don't really see a water line in the cabin itself, I don't know if this was cleaned or if we are potentially looking at an even deeper issue outside of the bilge pump, but unfortunately water was actually able to build up in this area here where we have a panel removed so that we can get to all of the wiring back here. And you can see that water actually got up to here. Now, it was really fortunate that the water stopped just under the command modules or the computers here in the helm, so luckily these were okay. But on the other side of that, the rest of the story isn't as good, because the water was able to rise above the harnesses here, where the plug that goes to the engine on this side looks fine and doesn't have any issues. When we pull this terminator off and look in here though, you can see water is still here in this terminator, which is a bad thing and can cause all kinds of communication issues. But then when we look at the 14-pin plug that goes to the other engine, seeing that this is a twin-engine boat, this harness went underwater and just completely corroded away the pins, as well as the pins that go to the other 14-pin data harness that goes to the back to the engine. So now we've got to change out this harness here that goes back to the engine, which means that we've got to pull this out through here from down the side of the boat and then de-rig the engine and probably de-pin the harness to get this plug off of the harness, which will allow us to pull the old harness out and the new harness in. And this is a sad state of affairs. The other harness is still fine and looks great though, but as for the other side on the CCM harness, which connects everything up here in the helm, like the computers, the key switches, the control box and everything else, the two plugs on both the engine harnesses and helm harnesses, these are just gone, and so we need to replace both of these harnesses. This is why we had to pull this panel out and get all this opened up so that we can replace the harness. And all this is due to a cheap bilge pump that didn't come on when it was supposed to. So a really typical boat problem is going to be a failed float switch or bilge pump. But a not so typical issue is going to be not catching that failure and getting it fixed before it gets out of hand and destroys some of the electrical components on the boat. Now, another problem that you might experience if we go back to talking about multiple people operating a boat is that sometimes someone might not know any better, or they might forget to turn off the battery switches on the boat, which, if you don't have any electrical issues and there aren't any parasitic draws on the system, won't be an issue. But if that person also forgets to turn the key switches off, now we are going to be dealing with some dead batteries. And something that you might not know about batteries is that they have what is called a cycle life. All that means is that each battery really only has so many times that it can be drained from 100% down to 0%. But there really isn't any battery that likes to be drained down to 0% anyway. That's really hard on the battery, and sometimes it can kill the battery. Newer batteries can usually handle this pretty well, but again, they only have so many cycles of that drainage down to 0%. But when we start talking about older batteries, like what we have here in the Venture, that are from 2017 and 2018, being 3 to 4 years old, these batteries are holding on as it is. And unfortunately, we just went through this exact scenario where someone left the switches on and the keys on, draining the batteries down to 0 and ultimately killing the batteries, because even though we recharged them, now they just won't hold a charge. And so we had to get down in here into this compartment and pull out the 4 old batteries and put in 4 new ones. Which these batteries aren't really that bad to mess with, they are pretty easy to do. The compartment is relatively roomy with enough space to lay down and still have access to move your arms around and work, where some boats' battery compartments can be a real pain to deal with, where you've got to lift the batteries out of a tight space and pull them over pump boxes or down in deep hatches, which isn't that bad until you're trying to move around an 80-pound Group 31 battery. Then that is not what you want to have to deal with, all because someone forgot to turn off the battery switches and the ignition keys. Giving us the moral of the story here, make sure you keep an eye on your boat and the things on your boat, your float switches, the bilge pumps, and make sure that the battery switches get turned off when you leave the boat. But let us know what kind of typical issues you've had to deal with on your boat in the community over at bornagainboating.com, as well as down in the comments section below. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. We want to thank you all for hanging out with us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.